Hi everyone, and thank you, Nicholas, for introduction. Um, as I'm sure you're all well aware, we have unique circumstances here in Israel, so I must apologize in advance in case alarms go off in my area. I'll have to run to shelter and leave you guys. In that case, Ido Khan is also present online. Will take over. He has his workstation in his shelter, so he can continue instead of in my place, but hopefully we won't come to that. Um, Also, another co-author on that work is Israel Finkelstein. And I won't elaborate too much on the EcoFuture project. I'm sure other members of the project, including Nikos himself, will do that much better than I do. I would, yeah, I will talk about our role in this project to put things in context is to study measures of interventions in order to produce a sustainable plan for the use of WEFE resources in the Jordan Valley area, one of the global hotspots in predicted in climate change in the world, and shared and strongly interdependent between three entities: the Jordan Kingdom, Palestine, and Israel. Uh, in a semi-arid region, which already experiences high fluctuations in rainfall availability, in climatic conditions. Um, and so our role as economists is to look at things in a different perspective, not just at a zero-sum game, as we'll elaborate soon, but in terms of beneficial uses and opportunities of how to mutually share these benefits in a way that advances everyone's best interest, right? So that's the kind of economic way of thinking of things, um, and not just as a who gets how much instead of the other. Having said that, so for example, economics lessons one-on-one, if someone is better in producing watches than the other, and the second is better in producing like fruit, it's worthwhile for them to specialize in growing things that they do best and then exchange in between them. That's the basic foundations of global trade. And we try to utilize these into the modeling approaches that we develop in asking both economic research questions, but also very practical policy relevant questions about the investments in infrastructure for water extraction, for water production, in through seawater desalination and conveyance, and also um, um, the pattern of crops to grow in different regions, which is most suitable to the exotic conditions that are prevalent in that area, and also that take into account the different constraints and policies that govern the decision making of individual farmers, for example. Um, So again, not repeating myself, but again, the major difference when looking at things from an economic point of view rather than an engineering point of view is that we're looking at some economic welfare, the values that are driven from the products or from the actual resources themselves, rather than looking at things in their own quantitative terms. Um, which creates a lot of opportunities for discussions in how to use and utilize the different resources. And we cannot continue without making you all in the room and experts in economics. So when we are talking about how to use a certain product or a certain good, how to allocate that, or what's the efficient point of using that, the amount of the product in the best possible way, We're trying to seek an equilibrium in economics between the demand for that product and the supply of that product. What's the demand is just the connection or the relationship between the quantity of the good and the price of it. And that curve here depicts that demand, which basically interprets to as quantity of the good increases, the amount of money a person, a consumer, is willing to pay for that good is decreasing, right? So if you think about water, it's something that we're going to be discussing here today. So if you're already here in the far left end of that curve and you have no water available for consumption, you would be willing to pay an enormous amount of money for that first unit of water available to you. And if that quantity grows and now you use water for washing your dishes, etc., and filling your outside swimming pool, the amount of money you will be willing to pay for an additional unit of water would decrease. The other side of things is the supply curve of water. So how much it costs to supply an additional unit of water to consumers. So when we start extracting the cheapest source, let's say surface water that runs by the stream next to our house, and we can just take, the old days, take a bucket, walk over and take the water and use it to irrigate our garden or to wash our clothes or to shower, etc., then that's the cheapest source of water. And when we exhaust that source of water and we have to move to more expensive sources, the additional unit of water to supply would cost more and more, all the way up to seawater desalination these days. And when we say that the intersection between those two curves is an equilibrium, because in this quantity exactly, not consumers nor suppliers have any incentive to supply more or less or consume more or less. Whereas if we, let's say, look at the quantity here, then consumers would be willing to pay more money than it costs to supply an additional unit of water. Therefore, here we won't have any equilibrium. We want to move further to the right up until the point where intersection happens, and that's the equilibrium. So now, after you're all experts in economics, and what we define as the economic welfare is the area that is confined in between those two curves, right? Let's move on to speak about the modeling approaches that we use and how do they utilize these approaches to decide about water allocation and water resources use and agricultural decision levels, also in terms of which crops to grow and how much water to use to irrigate the different crops, etc., which I'll demonstrate in a second. So one type of a modeling approach is termed MYWAS, the multi-year water allocation system. It goes all the way back to the early 19s, where an economist named Frank Fisher from MIT took the mission of demonstrating to the region, the Middle Eastern region of Israel, Palestine, and Jordan, that water could be exchanged as any economic good, as I already mentioned, generating benefits to all entities, and not just be a zero-sum game where, and definitely not one that worthwhile fighting over. And so what this model does, it depicts the water economy to the highest resolution, different water sources, the different consumers and consumer types, and decides optimally, in the objective of maximizing that economic welfare, how much water to allocate from each source to each use type. Also, very importantly, deciding how much infrastructure and which infrastructure to develop, considering the costs it entails of the developing that infrastructure. During the and judging by previous presentation, I don't have to tell you how much work is required to gather data to put data into models and build these models. The main efforts in these projects were to collect data and to build these modeling capacities, not only to Israel, where we already have models running and journal publications about different policy questions related to the water and agricultural sectors, but primarily to develop these modeling capacities for the West Bank and Gaza, obviously prior to the current situation, to looking at normal day status. And so first off, with respect to the water system, Israeli and Palestinian water systems are strongly interdependent. And so what we see here is the water system in the West Bank, for example. All the green names here are groundwater aquifers that are shared and mutually extracted in Israel and in Palestine, the West Bank. Blue governorates in Palestine are our domestic demands. We have agricultural demands at the governorate level and wastewater treatment plants. Noteworthy is that treatment plants that exist in West Bank are A, of limited capacity, and B, do not reuse treated wastewater in agriculture in a similar manner to Israel. Also in red, you would see these are a junction of the national water carrier in Israel that sends water, delivers water to Palestinian populations. And so the two systems are very strongly interdependent, and the Israeli system is much more elaborated and was developed through decades. And these junctions, as I mentioned, are connected to the Palestinian network. And although the Palestinian water supply network is very localized, the connection to the Israeli network basically integrates it into the larger integrated system in Israel, in which water could be transferred from north to south in the West Bank through the Israeli system. So we can either extract water up north and deliver it north, or forego that water quantity from the Israeli network and deliver it all the way to the south end of the West Bank and then extract it there. And as I mentioned, in Israel, almost all treated wastewater that are treated is reused for agricultural purposes. Now, I'll try to move much faster because I don't have a lot of time. We are simulating different constraints or different conditions that govern water supply in both potentially and in reality, to see where lies the greatest benefit to the region. One type of constraints is supply constraints through constraints on the groundwater extraction from the mutually shared resources, and we use as a known reference the Oslo Agreement allocation of the groundwater aquifers in between the two entities, constraining the diversions that from the Israeli system to the Palestinian network, and the combination of both. Another type of scenario is not allowing the model to basically develop wastewater treatment capacity and reuse capacities in the West Bank furthermore than the existing levels. And the last type of scenario is again fixing leakage levels to their current level, and a major issue in the Palestinian water network, where both physical leakage and inefficiency in collection of revenues sum up to somewhere in between 30 to 50% of the water supplied to in the system. So first off, as a general finding, and we found it in previous analysis in Israel, and when demand grows with time, primarily in the domestic sector, more fresh water is allocated for domestic consumers, at first at the expense of agricultural consumers, and then is further supplemented with seawater desalination. Farmers do not become losers from that allocation, but treated wastewater becomes the major source of water use in agriculture through treatment and reuse. And we see that the model does that when we allow it to develop that with a cost, again, emphasizing, does that in the Palestinian case as well, and even more so and more profoundly in the JV area. Looking at where treated wastewater reuse should flow, we see that when we allow for a cross-border treated wastewater flows, we see that it is more valuable from an economic from economic point of view in the West Bank than in the nearby adjacent agricultural areas in the JV in Israel, and therefore, when we allow for it, treated wastewater flows are diverted from Israel to the West Bank, the Jordan Valley area of the West Bank, but do create higher costs of alternative sources, what we call opportunity cost in economics, for Israeli farmers outside the Jordan Valley. Right. So, and finally, last slide with respect to the MYWAS only results, where we only look at the water consumption as demand functions. We'll soon elaborate on what we do with the value model. The last slide on the water issues are that we kind of compare the benefits that can accrue to the region as a whole, Israel and Palestine together, from these different constraints or things that govern water supply in the regions. We see that the largest beneficial outcomes would come from reusing wastewater treatment, reusing treated wastewater, and resolving leakage issues in the Palestinian areas. And again, another important outcome, which are already mentioned, but here you can see in a very clear way, is that in what we are looking here is what we call scarcity rents. It's the value of an additional unit of water in the groundwater aquifers, and we're separating groundwater aquifers that are mutually extracted by both entities and groundwater aquifers that are exclusively extracted by the Israeli system. And we see a very profound spillover effect where every type of constraint governing the Palestinian water network also affects the value or the scarcity of water resources that Israel is using exclusively. So there are definitely mutual benefits of tackling these issues. Now, if we look at the background of the demand functions that I just showed you for water, when we talk about agricultural irrigation, that there's an entire process, of course, of agricultural decision making that is derived from the prices of commodities in the markets and the technological processes of developing different crops and limitations of inputs, etc. So the value model is built just to represent those different considerations. And again, from an economic point of view, seeking economically efficient land allocation and water use across different crops. We model in Israel 55 types of crops. In Palestine, we developed that module, and this is what I'm going to show you through the EcoFuture project to study the effects of the different type of measures, the interventions related to the WEFE and Nexus. So the simulation of the value of that value model is using the outcomes we just looked at from the MYWAS integrated combined Israeli-Palestinian MYWAS model runs. We take the last year of the planning horizon of 2050 and look at how these agricultural transformation strategy measures that were devised through the work of the in EcoFuture project affect agricultural decisions as well as the economic welfare of Palestinian agricultural sector. So the two measures are smart irrigation that can reduces about 30% of water use per unit of land. It's associated with some operation and maintenance costs and an investment that is spread over a certain horizon. So that's the investment, but we put into the model the capital return on that investment. And we simulate that across these scenarios that we've just looked at in these MYWAS runs. So one thing we observe is a shift in land allocation due to those interventions, due to these measures, where land is allocated away from rain-fed wheat and rain-fed olives, which is the main crop grown in the West Bank, into irrigated olive trees, and it says grapes, rain-fed grapes, but because there are either, let's say, intensively irrigated grapes and mildly irrigated or only supplemental irrigation, which still requires some irrigation and cannot be fully reliant on rainfall. So and then also we see an increase in land across almost all crops, irrigated crops, that is attributed to those savings in water, and additional water comes from the collection of or harvesting of water from greenhouses. And interestingly, we see a small decline of land allocation to a crop grown under greenhouse, which is maybe counterintuitive, but could be associated with the additional cost embedded in implementing the smart irrigation system, making it relatively less profitable than other crops. In terms of water use, what we see as an outcome is that the water use patterns change across governorates. So, for example, Tubas and Jenin, which Tubas is it is in the Jordan Valley area of interest, and Jenin is just next to it. Also to Karim, those are all areas that governorates and agriculture areas that specialize in vegetable production, are actually, due to that introduction of these measurements of these measures, actually decrease the water quantity use or the water consumption, and primarily their treated wastewater reuse quantities, whereas other regions like Hebron and Ramallah are increasing their treated wastewater use. So a trade-off emerges in between the incentivizing treated wastewater reuse, which we just mentioned, versus adopting these strategies. Finally, is an economic outcome. When we look at economic outcomes, we can definitely see gains or beneficial gains attributed to these measures of interventions that can create large enough benefits to cover the costs of investments from a large-scale social point of view. However, we do see some trade-offs, of course, as I mentioned. So, summing up, if we imitate Israel's success in terms of developing the water economy, Israel has put a lot of money and efforts as I mentioned, last decades, to build an integrated system that carries produces water in the seas, water desalination, reuses treated wastewater, and basically allows it to convey the water across the entire country, mitigating local constraints and conditions that are very different across from the far north of the country all the way to the far south of the country, where it's a complete desert that doesn't get any rain, allowing crops to be grown in areas that have 100 millimeter a year of rainfall, to grow vegetables and fruit in that area. So imitating that system in Palestine, specifically treated wastewater reuse, is a crucial implementation that needs to happen, and is of mutual benefit to both Israel and Palestine. The different measures that were devised through the EcoFuture are definitely could be well for improving, but do create some trade-offs in terms of demand for the different water sources. So this has to be taken into account when thinking about how to implement or how to incentivize the use of these measures. And finally, what I showed you here is just the tip of the fork in terms of the model development. Now, what type of research and policy relevant questions we can ask with these models.